Hi everybody. I want to end this module with a really kind of quick discussion about the common pitfalls in requirements gathering, and also go over some of the metrics that you can use to understand when things in the requirements gathering phase are not maybe going as well as they could. So the first part of this is going back to what project scope is. And so previously we defined this as basically the amalgamation of all of the requirements that are gathered for the system. And it represents all of the work that the development team actually has to accomplish in order for the project to be complete. So what can happen is if you don't have a pretty rigid definition around what is in scope, if you don't have a pretty rigid list of requirements, people can come back to you and ask questions about missing functionality, and you don't have a kind of curated list of expected functionality to go back to. So if you have a list of requirements, you can always go back to that list of requirements and say, oh, well, you never told us that it was supposed to do X, Y, Z. We can absolutely add that to the project, but we're going to have to scope it, and we're also going to have to find budget in order to pay for it. So this is kind of one of the ways that you can make sure to manage overages, because you can clearly tell the client, and the client clearly understands what is in scope or inside of the project and what is out of scope or outside the bounds of the work that's currently being done to build the system. So the most common thing to happen to a software project that makes it go over budget is that these lines between what is in scope and what is out of scope become very blurred, and out of scope items creep into project scope. And so you have probably heard this referred to as scope creep, which is going to be one of the things that we talk about here. So scope creep happens when the project scope itself kind of gradually expands to include work that wasn't originally discussed. So this can be something as explicit as a new batch of functionality that was never thought about previously. And so the development team had no idea that this series of requirements were required. And so you have to be careful when adding requirements and make sure that those requirements are actually relevant to things that are in scope work. If you're adding requirements for out of scope work, you have to be very clear that it's in a different phase of the development, or if it's at a different release or something like that, then it isn't actually budgeted for in this actual phase of the project. So this is obviously kind of the most common way that projects can go over budget in terms of both time and money, because even if you don't actually develop code that supports a requirement, it still takes time to understand the requirement and log the requirement and document the requirement. So even if you are building out requirements for a later phase of the project, you're still spending time in one phase that was not originally budgeted for the work that you're trying to do. So it's also true that sometimes expanding scope is okay. Everybody knows that the main thing that agile development is trying to do is make sure that we can kind of react to changes that happen that are outside of everybody's control. So if the client is undergoing some sort of new task, or they're uncovering some new problem that they have that they need help to resolve. It may be that they need their system to do something the previous system did not do, and they didn't have a good understanding of it to begin with. The important thing is, if you are accepting scope creep, you should also prepare the client to expand the budget. So every time a requirement is added to the backlog, what you should be able to do is estimate the level of effort in order to accomplish the work to support that requirement. And if that budgeted amount of money goes, or the estimated amount of work exceeds the budgeted amount of work for the project, you need to immediately go back to the client and tell them that they're going to have to find funding somewhere, or find project time somewhere in order to actually support the requirements that they need to add to the scope. The sort of important thing to remember is that scope creep is not necessarily all bad. Scope creep can be good as long as it is appropriately budgeted. So scope creep merely means that you are adding functionality to the application. Additional functionality is usually totally fine as long as the client is happy paying for it, so it's giving them something that they're comfortable paying for, and it is paying for developers to actually do their jobs. If it happens gradually and kind of implicitly, and there's no organizational decision around accepting the scope creep, what happens is the developers typically spend time generating code to do this additional support or support these additional use cases, and the client is not happy paying for it, and so the developers don't get paid for their time, or the features don't get completed, and so the client doesn't actually get the benefit of those new features. So when scope creep is not an intentional kind of thing, then that is bad. So we use the negative term scope creep to indicate creep that is kind of out of the blue. It happens over a very long period of time. Nobody recognizes it's happening. And then suddenly the project is 3 times larger than it was originally planned to be. And you have all of these problems trying to pay for 3 times the code with the same amount of money. So one of the ways that you can kind of make sure that scope creep, good or bad, doesn't torpedo the project is using a formal change request process. So the sort of naive concept of a requirement is that once you've recorded the requirement and it's documented, it's never going to change. It's going to stay the same for the life cycle of the project. But exactly like code, those requirements will also change throughout time as the client's needs change and as your ability to implement things change. So change requests are kind of an accepted fact of life, but you kind of need a formal process for accepting those because change requests should trigger all of these checks to make sure that you're not changing a requirement such that it exceeds its original scope. And what I mean by that is potentially you could have originally intended to have a task management system, and that task management system has the concept of a project where you can group a whole bunch of tasks into a project. If the requirement to group tasks into a project goes way deeper than that. So instead of just projects, you could have projects and project groups and groups of project groups, all of this sort of recursive stuff. And you have to be able to manage adding and subtracting and reassigning tasks, and you keep adding more and more and more tasks. What happens is an originally low-level requirement can become exceedingly high-level as other requirements get packed inside of that requirement. And this one change request has now greatly exceeded the budget, because originally all you needed to do was tag a row in a database with a project tag. Now you have to do all sorts of database work to make sure that there are various levels of projects and projects inside of projects and so on and so forth. So just a simple change request can also inject scope creep into the project, and that's the take-home message. It doesn't necessarily have to be a whole new feature. It can be what seems like a slight change to a feature that ultimately balloons into a way larger thing than anybody expected. So what you are kind of interested in doing is making sure that the formal change request process has some visibility in the Teams meeting. And the reason is because you want everybody, all the stakeholders, to be aware of any changes that are being requested by the business team, so that they have an idea of the volatility of their own requirements, and they can kind of expect that there's going to be some inefficiency associated with having a whole bunch of changes for requirements. So again, the point of a formal change request is to bake in this kind of implicit step in the process where if a client is requesting that a requirement change drastically, that they are making it obvious, at least to themselves, that that's going to have some impact on the budget, and that they should be prepared to come to the table with more resources, or they should expect the project timeline to kind of lag a little bit as the development team processes and tries to actually implement that large change. So some of the metrics that you can use to understand when things are maybe kind of going sideways during requirements gathering, there are 3 of them that I want to talk about. The first one is requirements velocity. So this is basically a measure of how many different requirements you are generating over any specified period of time. So one interesting or popular way of doing this is how many requirements are you generating over a week, sort of between weekly meetings. If you are generating 500 requirements per week, you recognize that there is a lot of work kind of stacking up. If you're only generating maybe 1 requirement, you know that maybe we're nearing the end of requirements gathering, or we're just not doing very much work. And in either of those cases, something maybe needs to happen. The next one is requirements volatility. So this kind of measures how frequently requirements in general are changing. So if you have generated 500 requirements and none of those 500 requirements have changed in a week, that's a fairly good sign. If you have generated 500 requirements and all of those 500 requirements have changed 3 times a piece, that means that you're in a very chaotic situation and you don't necessarily want to be pushing to the implementation phase or the design phase in that situation, because you are not even really sure that the requirements that you're gathering are high quality yet. And change frequency looks at how frequently a change happens on a specific requirement. And so what this can do is this can show you which requirements are really well baked, they're well understood by both teams, and which requirements need a little bit more work. Those requirements are typically the kind of problem makers of the project, and you kind of have to watch them a little bit more closely. So the idea around requirements velocity is that as you near the end of requirements gathering, the system becomes fully scoped, and you should expect a decrease in the overall velocity of the number of requirements that are being generated. So if you are nearing the end of implementation, going into testing, or you're ending testing and going into, you hope, a release, then you are still generating a large number of requirements. That serves as a warning that you maybe shouldn't be releasing the piece of software, or you should be ramping up for a fairly involved phase 2 or a 2.0 release of the software. It gives you an idea that there's still a lot of work happening on the front end, even if you're in the implementation phase on some of the requirements. The idea ultimately is that you want to be able to pace the project. So this gives you an idea of how much work there is to do on the front end, so that you're not taking on a whole bunch of additional work, thinking that you're almost done and ready to go to market. If you're looking at a project and you have a whole bunch of velocity, that means that you're fundamentally experiencing scope expansion, and you have to be very careful about the budget. So if you have a very tight or very set budget, and you have based that budget on the requirements that were already gathered, but week over week you're still getting dozens and dozens of requirements added to the system, you know very early that you need to go back to the business team and see about prioritizing those requirements, maybe into a phase 2 that's at a later date, or acquiring more funds for the budget to make sure that you don't have time overages that the client isn't expecting and can't pay for. So the same thing about velocity is true about volatility. You hope that as you near the end of requirements gathering, and you get a fully scoped system, you see a drastic decrease in the volatility of those requirements. So if you are nearing completion of testing and you have a whole bunch of changes that are constantly happening in requirements, you know that your testing can't be going very well, because your tests should actually match against the expectations of what the system is doing. If the requirements are constantly changing, you don't necessarily know that your tests are checking the correct thing. So this serves as kind of a warning that if you're nearing completion of the project and you're still having a lot of turnover in the requirements phase, maybe it's time to slow down and stop wasting effectively resources on testing, because you need to make sure that your tests align with what the expected behavior of the system is. The other kind of interesting thing that volatility can do is it can tell you when there is kind of cognitive dissonance on the behalf of the business team. So what this does is it tells you that maybe you need to have an additional meeting to sit down with the various stakeholders on the business team and get them all on the same page in terms of what are the priorities in terms of requirements and why requirements keep changing week over week. Basically, you can think of high volatility projects as the projects that are the most likely to be spending resources inefficiently. So it's kind of okay to have a lot of requirements volatility at the beginning of a project, but persistent high volatility usually means that you are wasting any development resources that you have in the implementation or the testing phase, because as you implement and test requirements, those same requirements could be changing, and in that case, a lot of, if not all of the work that was previously done has to be thrown out and redone, or potentially is going to have to go through a lot of refactoring in order to actually work as intended. So on the flip side of that, if you have requirements in a system with very low volatility, that means that all of those requirements are fairly well understood. Everybody on both of the teams kind of accepts the requirements for what they are. That also means that the development team has read through those requirements. They don't have any questions, or they don't have any concerns with the requirements that would have spurred additional change. So at that point, it's safe to begin the further phases of development. And so if you have a fairly large stack of low volatility requirements, that's a great place to start analyzing those requirements into a specifications document, designing the system, and actually implementing the system. And you can kind of rest assured that the requirements that you have are fairly high quality. So change frequency is kind of an interesting one because it looks at a specific requirement, not the set of all requirements inside of your project. So ideally, you would have minimal change frequency across all of the requirements all of the time. And what that would mean is that you were able to gather a requirement from the client that both the development team and the business team were happy with from the very beginning. As the requirement itself changes, the tendency is for it to change again. The highest frequency changes happen on the least understood requirements. And so typically what happens is there's this sort of self-feeding cycle of requirements needing to change because of changes that were previously done. And so these are typically indicators of either a requirement that people don't actually understand or a requirement that indicates a very controversial sort of decision on the business team. And so in either of those cases, usually communication is the best way to alleviate the problem. But this is a metric that will kind of identify that the problem is actually happening. Another thing to think about as we talk about the later phases of development is it's really kind of helpful to have a list of requirements throughout the project that have high change frequency, because typically these are the riskiest requirements to actually implement. And so high change frequency is often correlated to high bugs or frequency of bugs. And the frequency of a bug in a piece of code indicates that that code will continue to be buggy. And so these are certainly requirements or certainly pieces of code that you want to keep your eye on until release and potentially even after release as the kind of highest risk components of the system that could cause you trouble. They could be the things that will break after the system goes into use, or they will be the things that end users have the most complaints about. So the last thing I want to talk about is the case, the idea of CASE. So CASE is an acronym that stands for Computer-Aided Software Engineering. And the intent is for these pieces of software to help you generate other pieces of software. And so these can range from things like Microsoft Excel, just a spreadsheet to keep track of requirements or something like that, all the way up to something really, really formal like Microsoft Project. So if you've never even heard of Microsoft Project, it's a project management suite that was created by Microsoft. And basically it lets you break down projects into phases. It lets you do sprint planning, all sorts of really fine-grained management for a project inside of an application. And that is a perfect example of what a case tool is. It's basically just software that helps with the creation of other software. There are two sort of vocabulary words that are used in the textbook. One of them is a case workbench and the other is a case system. These are basically just collections of tools. You can think about Microsoft Office being a collection of tools. And the idea is that these collections, they help you support multiple phases of development. So one of the tools in the system might help you actually gather requirements, and the next one might actually help you build use case diagrams out of those requirements, so on and so forth. So the idea is these things automate as much as possible each step of the development process. Case, wow, missing the slide. So I'll update the slide deck, but basically case for requirements gathering, it contains all sorts of, and you can actually see on the screen a little bit, very faintly. But basically the case tools for requirements gathering do things like put together all of the requirements for the system. They help you generate use case diagrams for each of those requirements. They map requirements to each other. So for example, if you have a high level requirement that's mapped to many low level requirements, it will help you do that mapping. They also do things like prioritization. So not all requirements are created the same. And so if a client tells you that this requirement is absolutely pivotal and without it we won't accept the system, obviously you're going to do that requirement at the very beginning of the project if you can. And so these case management tool or case tools let you manage that situation. They help you with all of the different components of requirements gathering as a phase. So to kind of wrap up the whole sort of module, you have a situation in college where you're doing programming assignments. Those programming assignments have rubrics, and those rubrics maybe have a bulleted list of all the things that you're supposed to have in order to get a good grade on the project. The fact is, software engineering projects do not have such a rubric. And unfortunately, it's sort of the software engineering or the development team's job to figure out what that rubric looks like. And requirements gathering is the process through which you do that. And so it's extremely non-trivial, A, to actually get an understanding of what the requirements are, and B, it's not trivial to manage that process as you go through the project. So just because you're good at eliciting requirements doesn't necessarily mean that you are the best at making sure that all the requirements are prioritized or all the requirements are kept up to date as they change, as the situation for the client changes. So to finalize that, you can use all of these metrics that we talked about: velocity, volatility, change frequency, all these kind of things to kind of get your head around the context that's around your requirements gathering efforts. So if you have the ideal situation would be that you've elicited a whole bunch of requirements from the client, you have a sufficient number of requirements to go to implementation, and not only are those requirements not changing very frequently, they're also not getting added to week over week, then that means that you can kind of rest assured that if you go into the analysis or the design or the implementation phase, you're at the minimum risk that you can kind of reasonably expect to have. On the flip side, if you have a constant deluge of requirements and you have a constant deluge of changes to those requirements, you're not in a position to go to even analysis yet, because any work that you do in the other phases of the development process could potentially be undone by one of these changes to a requirement that's fairly frequently happening. So I hope that this module kind of illustrated requirements gathering maybe from a 10,000 foot perspective. If you have questions, if you have comments or concerns or anything like that, please reach out and let me know. I'm happy to answer those as best I can. And I hope that it also gets you in the mindset of trying to fill out the project proposal for the group projects, which is due next week on Friday. The requirements gathering process will be easier, I hope, because you will be both the business and the development team. But it's important to think about all the stuff that we've talked about in these 3 lectures while you're trying to put together the group project, because it is supposed to kind of emulate a real world experience. So I hope that you all enjoy the content. I hope that you enjoy the group project. Please let me know if you have questions, and thank you for tuning in.